Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Jesus and the Essenes by Manly P. Hall. An article taken from Horizon, the Magazine of Useful and Intelligent Living, Volume 7, Number 3, Winter 1947. Jesus and the Essenes by Manly P. Hall. A number of mystical, religious, and philosophical sects flourished in Syria about the time of the beginning of the Christian era. Among these must be included the Kabbalists, the Old Johannites, the Syrian Gnosis, the Samaritans, the Essenes, and the Assyrians, who were referred to in 1 Maccabees as mighty men of Israel. While some of these groups were essentially Jewish in character, others revealed strong foreign influences. Like most Near Eastern nations whose culture developed along caravan routes, the Syrians produced a variety of polygenetic cults, and these in turn influenced the early Christian communities. After the Romans had made themselves masters of Palestine, the Jewish sects were colored to a considerable degree by political considerations. The Romans naturally regarded this coloring as subversive and attempted to destroy all such organizations. As a result, several societies previously pursuing their programs publicly went underground and became secret fraternities. In this way, some sects vanished permanently, and we have no further record of their activities. In all probability, they did not survive as formal organizations. Others took on an appearance entirely different from their original form and descended as esoteric cults among the Jewish families scattered by the diaspora. Christian historians have realized that in order to understand the psychological overtones of the gospel stories of Jesus and his ministry, it was necessary to restore, at least to a degree, the times and circumstances which resulted in this new religious dispensation. All effects in nature are suspended from adequate causes, and a religion is not a spontaneous generation. Fortunately, reasonably complete histories of the period are available, and it is possible to estimate with considerable accuracy the forces at work beneath the surface of Jewish society of that time. The modern thinker is no longer content to accept the gospel stories without question or reflection. He is convinced that the life and ministry of Jesus have a natural explanation. So he asks several entirely reasonable questions, such as, where was Jesus educated? Was he a member of one of the mystical communities of his time? And what was the actual substance of his teaching? These issues have been obscured by a general attitude of veneration and by the variety of interpretations of the later creeds of Christendom. But obscuration is not solution, and it is important to the integrity of man's spiritual convictions that he know the facts. Unfortunately, there is no historical source of material on the life of Jesus outside the gospel and certain apocryphal writings. These accounts deal almost exclusively with the teachings of the Master and do not advance the cause of the critical historian. The total absence of dates and the contradictory nature of the references to historical persons and places only add to the general confusion. The accounts given in the 4 Gospels supply no information about the life of Jesus between his 12th and 30th years. Thus, over half of the period of his physical incarnation is a complete mystery. At this late time, it is unlikely that documents bearing upon this wide gap will come to light, as nearly every possible source has been explored without success. We should be cautious in accepting unproved accounts or reports belonging to a later period which attempt to bridge this biographical interval. Unless it can be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that such explanations are founded upon some solid ground of contemporary witnesses, they must be heavily discounted. A number of fabrications have been circulated and plausible stories invented to sustain them, but they all collapse when subjected to careful and impartial research. Several writers have advanced the hypothesis that Jesus was a member of the Essene fraternity. In all fairness, we must admit the plausibility of the idea, but we must also acknowledge that there is no actual proof that he belonged to this sect. There is some circumstantial evidence in favor of such an affiliation, but we must be honest and not encourage directional thinking which is semantically unsound. The most that we dare to say is that there is a good possibility, even a probability, that Jesus was an Essene. We base this probability not upon historical records, but upon the life and teachings of the man himself. In order to justify the assumption that Jesus was a member of the Essene communion, it is necessary first to examine the sect, its origin, its teachings, and its rites. Here again we must proceed cautiously, for the Essene order itself presents many difficulties. No complete record of its doctrines have descended to us, and we must depend upon the superficial observations of such an historian as Josephus. He devoted considerable space to the Essenes in his monumental history of the Jews and the wars of the Jews, but he writes as an observer, not as a participator in their esoteric tradition. Additional fragments relating to the Essenes are to be found in the writings of Philo Judaeus and Pliny the Elder. Of these two, Philo may be regarded as the best equipped to estimate the philosophy of the Essenes, but he gives us only a few paragraphs. These are the only contemporary authorities of importance, and all subsequent writers have depended upon them in writing upon the subject. Even the name of the sect is difficult to interpret. The word Essene does not indicate the name of the founder or any particular locality, nor does it give any clue to the origin of the fraternity. All efforts to define the word are speculative. We can take our choice of such definitions as the holy ones, the oracles, the mysterious ones, the elders, the healers, the pure ones, the hermits, or the silent ones. Heckathorn, in the secret societies of all ages and countries, advances the ingenious theory that the Essenes took their name from the Essene, or breastplate, worn by the Jewish high priest in the tabernacle rites. He feels that the Essenes, because of their mystical doctrine, were opposed to the faith of the Orthodox Jews and were forced to take every possible precaution to escape persecution. The order was divided into 4 grades or degrees, and the advancement of the member was accomplished by a series of initiations. Even those who had received the 3rd degree were not admitted into the secret assembly, nor did they receive the higher keys of the doctrine. Only such as were found entirely trustworthy after a long period of observation became aware of the true purpose for which the sect had been founded. Heckathorn writes, the 4 degrees were respectively called the faithful, the illuminate, the initiated, and the perfect. The faithful received at their initiation a new or baptismal name, and this was engraved with a secret mark upon a white stone, probably alluded to in Revelation 2:17, which, as we shall hereafter see, was not Christian in its origin, which he retained as a voucher of his membership. The usual sign was the cross, though other signs also were employed. The Essene community at Engedi near the Dead Sea was in existence for several centuries before the beginning of the Christian era. Just how long no one seems to know, but the passing remark of Pliny that the sect had lasted for thousands of ages is certainly an exaggeration. It has been suggested that the Essene order was founded by the Greek philosopher Pythagoras during his residence in Palestine. Others hold that it was imported from Asia or that it developed from the teachings of Zoroaster. These speculations are derived from an attempt to analyze the doctrine of the order, but the Essene initiates never revealed the esoteric parts of their philosophy to the profane, so it is extremely difficult to estimate the true source of their traditions. They are believed to have held many of the beliefs associated with the Greek mystery schools, but their ascetic way of life binds them to Eastern religious disciplines. The school of Pythagoras was built upon an Oriental pattern as the result of the initiation of this great sage into the mysteries of the Brahmins at Elephanta and Ellora in central India. The exoteric life of the Essene community revealed a highly evolved socialized consciousness. The sect was divided into 2 groups, of which the highest was dedicated to absolute celibacy and rejected marriage and all human ties and relationships, except spiritual fellowship. The lower group was composed of householders who could marry and raise families. It is believed that the older members of this class, after their children had grown up, could take the final vows of continence and be advanced to membership in the higher group. Even those who married were expected and required to live in a state of the utmost purity and to view all human relationships as symbolical of spiritual mysteries. The lower group was therefore a kind of confraternity of laymen who were not ready to renounce all physical attachments but were inclined to conform with certain parts of the Essene code. Both groups lived according to a highly socialized and idealized communal concept. They renounced all worldly possessions, sharing their goods in common and holding nothing for themselves. In this they were similar to the Pythagoreans. It would seem that the Essenes originated among that class of the Jews which practiced agriculture and the various trades. They were a hard-working people who regarded the sweat of honest toil as the true water of baptism. Every able-bodied man was required to contribute a certain number of hours each day to some line of endeavor, which would increase the revenue of the community. Many were farmers, tilling arid and unfruitful land. Some were carpenters and builders, and most limited themselves to menial occupations. There is indication, however, that a few members of the sect were men of outstanding mental ability. Frequently, these were appointed as teachers of the young, and during the Roman occupation, the more important officials selected Essenes as tutors for their children. There is also record that some of the Essenes practiced divination by the stars, could interpret dreams, and prophesy future events. It was against the code of the order that any of its members should engage in barter or exchange, nor could they work in any trade that took life or profited from the labors of others. They were excused from military duty by Roman law, and were pacifists even at the cost of their own lives. Whatever money they earned, the Essenes deposited in a common treasury, and from this fund was purchased anything required by the members. They sat at one table and ate only the simplest foods. Even their clothing was allotted to them according to the needs of the seasons. They wore their garments as long as decency permitted, but kept them clean and mended. They had no fine clothes and wore no jewelry or other decorations. Some of the lower grade who were childless adopted orphans or the children of relatives. These they raised and educated with the greatest care. All children dwelling in the community were supplied from the funds of the order. Those who were sick or injured were given constant and loving care and protected from all want to the end of their lives. The old were held in the highest esteem, for it was remembered that they had worked faithfully as long as their strength permitted. The celibate group was perpetuated either from the lower grade or by new members drawn to the society by the ideals which it taught. Many took refuge with the sect to escape the sorrows and misfortunes of the outer world. Among all races and nations, there are some gentle and sensitive persons who desire to retire from intense competitive living and seek refuge in monastic orders. This type cast their lot with the Essenian sect, where they found not only physical asylum, but a calm and kindly atmosphere and spiritual security. The Essenes practiced mystical rites, held prayers before sunrise, and said grace before their meals. They believed in the corruptibility of the body and in the immortality of the soul. The soul was bound to the body as though imprisoned, but through disciplining the flesh and releasing the mind and heart from all worldliness, the soul could be liberated and could ascend to the subtle air from which it came. Good souls came in the end to a happy habitation in a beautiful land beyond an ocean. Philo mentions that in his time the sect numbered about 4,000. The Essenes kept no slaves and acknowledged no masters, believing that all men were created by God to be free and equal. They acknowledged no aristocracy except such advancement as came from spiritual growth, and those who had attained to a larger consciousness were the humblest among them. The sect was not disputatious, rejected logic, but was much addicted to ethics. They belonged to the mystical dissent teaching that only those who lived the life of virtue could know the soul doctrine. They were bound by vows and obligations, and not even torture could force them to reveal their esoteric teachings. It was also a rule that under no condition must a member show pain or sorrow. They were very stoical, but at the same time believed that they should preserve a happy disposition and appearance. Disciplines were not burdens, but privileges. A man should not grow toward God mournfully and despondently. That which he sought to obtain was the greatest good, and he should make the path of attainment a joyous experience. Although the sect was regarded as heretical by some of the more conservative Jewish schools, the Essenes were widely regarded as persons of the highest character. Crime was unknown among them, and they were models of uprightness. Little is known of the order after the 1st century of the Christian era. Some authorities believe that the fraternity was absorbed into the early Christian communities. Others consider it probable that it was perpetuated in the structure of later Jewish mystical movements. This then was the mystical order to which Jesus may have belonged. Edward Schurer, in his Jesus, the Last Great Initiate, weaves a delightful, if not entirely scholarly, web of circumstances to sustain the probability of Jesus having been initiated into the Essenian mysteries. His reasoning is logical, but we should remember that the Essenes rejected logic. He sees Joseph the carpenter practicing a trade common to the order. Is it not likely that Joseph and Mary belonged to that degree of the order which permitted marriage for pure and spiritual motives? If Jesus had been raised in such a socialized environment, it would explain the basic tenets of his teachings. He brought a simple message to the common man. He emphasized the brotherhood of humanity as they did. He wore the long hair and simple white robe, which was the distinguishing dress of the Syrian mystical sects. He was recognized by John the Baptist as a holy person and a teacher. He revealed the mystical content of his message only to certain of his closest followers and taught the others by means of parables. His deportment was gentle and humble, and he spoke of the mysteries of God as one who was initiated. All these parallels are beyond question, but no contemporary writer links the name of Jesus with any of the religious sects of his day. Perhaps these records have been destroyed, but it is strange that none of the disciples should have mentioned a single word on this vital subject. We can only say that there are striking similarities between the original teachings of Jesus and the known tenets of the Essene cult. No investigation of the early life of Jesus would be complete without an effort to fill in the long period of 18 years in which there is no record of his activity. Recourse to the old Jewish writings offers a possible clue. The Talmud mentions a teacher who more or less answers the description of Jesus, who traveled to Egypt in his youth and remained there many years, mastering the magical arts of the Egyptians. Here again, we are in the presence of a highly reasonable probability. Most disciples of the esoteric tradition at that time did visit Egypt, which was the shrine and repository of the ancient wisdom. There is another account to the effect that Jesus studied in the monastery in Tibet, and that records proving this still exist in some of the trans-Himalayan libraries. While it is also possible that Jesus, like Apollonius of Tyana, could have penetrated Asia, the Tibetan notion presents insurmountable obstacles. It should be remembered that the civilization of Tibet did not begin until the 7th or 8th century BC. At that time, Buddhist monks from India penetrated into the country and began the conversion of its people. There could not have been any high culture which would justify a long and hazardous journey among the Tibetans at the beginning of the 1st century AD. In the time of Jesus, the Tibetans were cannibals, without a written language or any important cultural institutions. Contrary to the beliefs of the early church, there is every indication that Jesus did prepare himself for his ministry in one or more of the esoteric schools flourishing at his time. If he did not go to India, Egypt, or Greece, he enrolled himself in one of the Syrian groups which had derived their authority from the adept tradition of Chaldea, Persia, or the Lebanon. It is known that an esoteric school flourished at Mount Lebanon from before the time of Solomon the king. Modern druses trace their origin to the initiates, or cedars of Lebanon. Modern writers have a tendency to consider the Therapeutai of Lake Maeotis in Egypt as a branch of the Essenian sect. The Therapeutai, the physicians of the soul, were a community of Jewish mystics who had fled from Alexandria to escape persecution as a minority group. Although the sect is now mentioned rather frequently, only one ancient writer has left any account of them. We are indebted to Philo-Judaeus for all that is known of the Egyptian Therapeutai. Even his story has been questioned, but it is the consensus of opinion of recent scholars that Philo's narration is genuine. Although the Therapeutai have some doctrines in common with the Essenes, we are not justified in regarding the two groups as identical. Whereas the Essenes were mystics, the Therapeutai were highly advanced intellectuals. This hermit brotherhood had but a brief existence because it provided no practical means for its own perpetuation. The group was highly socialized, even communized, but its members were devoted entirely to contemplation and reflection. They did not engage in any remunerative endeavor and literally perished for lack of funds. Those joining the Therapeutai must give away all their worldly possessions, bringing nothing with them but their clothing and their books. We do not know how they tried to support themselves, for even the simplest way of life demands certain replenishments. Perhaps they depended upon the gifts of friends and relatives. If so, it is not likely they fared too well. Perhaps they believed that it was possible to retire to an unfrequented place and live off of the bounty of the land, but in Egypt the soil was not overly bountiful. In the Therapeutic community, each family had its own allotment, and they built small homes or houses, each containing 2 rooms. In the larger room they lived. In the smaller room was a chapel for private worship. It is not known with certainty whether marriage was permitted, but both men and women of pure life could become members. The Therapeutai are reminiscent of certain Hindu orders of extreme asceticism. The Asiatic mystics dwell either alone or in small groups in remote places, maintaining little if any contact with the outside world. If the Therapeutai were impractical and improvident, they had no regulations against the enjoyment of such creature comforts as came their way. They conserved small luxuries and dressed themselves with the best they possessed. Their austerities were entirely mental, and according to Philo, they were a jolly, good-natured, optimistic group, bearing their privations with a rare sense of humor. To them, happiness was the badge of the wise man, and superiority was judged solely by standards of advanced scholarship. They did not venerate age, electing their leaders for the maturity of their minds, regardless of their years. Like the Essenes, they recognized no class distinction and kept no slaves. Once every 7 weeks, the Therapeutai assembled for their most solemn festival. All wore white robes and gathered for a philosophical feast. They reclined on crude couches, not scorning cushions if they were available, the men on one side of the room and the women on the other. The senior members were served by the novices. All were vegetarians, and their food was of the simplest kind, seasoned with herbs. They drank only water. Before the meal, there was a religious lecture, terminated by the members signifying that they had heard enough. When all had finished eating, there was what Philo called a sacred singing dance. The male and female choruses, each directed by a leader, joined in imitation of the songs of Moses and Miriam at the crossing of the Red Sea. They understood the deliverance of Israel from bondage in Egypt as signifying the release of the human soul from the captivity of bodily passions. There is a report that the Therapeutai had an initiation ritual and sacred writings, but no details of either have been preserved. If Jesus spent those unrecorded years among the Egyptians, as the Jewish records would indicate, it is well within reason that he could have visited this community of his own people, which flourished beside Lake Mautis, the Last Supper, where Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples, included sacred songs and dances, like the banquets of the Therapeutai. But other groups had similar rituals, so we cannot afford to jump to conclusions. The Therapeutai vanished from history at about the same time as the Essene. The disappearance has never been adequately explained, but in the case of the Egyptian group, it may have been due to lack of financial support. It is hardly necessary to enlarge upon other smaller mystical sects of the Jews in order to point up our primary concern. All of these fraternities were about the same in general structure, and as political problems increased, most of the cults developed messianic theories. Each was waiting for the coming of a Messiah who would liberate the Jewish people from their physical bondage to the Romans. As a result, they were exterminated or scattered to prevent political agitation. The Kabbalists emerged at about the time the other sects were fading from view. Perhaps there is a connection. It would be useful to a more intelligent grasp of Christian fundamentals to realize that Christianity was not a spontaneous revelation, but the natural development of pre-Christian transcendentalism. We've so long regarded the Christian faith as separate and unique that we have lost sight of its true place in the descent of universal religion. We cannot hope to overcome the confusion and intolerance which have distinguished the later developments of Christian theology unless we grasp the larger pictures of world religion. Instead of thinking of several major religious organizations towards which we should develop certain tolerant attitudes, let us rather realize that there is only one religion in the world. The faiths of men are merely human interpretation of one spiritual mystery. Just as the light of the sun results in a diversity of phenomena, so the light of truth has brought forth many faiths which it nourishes and sustains, each according to its own needs and requirements. No religion is unique. The unfolding of the spiritual tradition of our race is an evolution of doctrines, a growth from one root. Just as civilization itself is built up layer upon layer, so religion is perfected by raising new structures on old foundations. Once we understand the religion of our race, we have the keys to all the separate groups, cults, and sects. As man unfolds his own internal perceptive and reflective faculties, he becomes more and more aware of the spiritual mystery about him and within him. It is the growth of man that brings the growth of religion. The eternal faith is always present, but men discover it by degrees. Each degree becomes a religion suitable to the time and conditions under which it is discovered. The discovery of a religion is much like the discovery of a friend. We meet someone and he becomes an acquaintance. As time passes and association gives opportunity, we begin to discover the qualities, ideals, and characteristics of our acquaintance. If we find these qualities compatible with our own dispositions, acquaintance verges toward friendship, not because our friend has changed, but because we have learned to know him. The religion of our race had its origin in the great mountain region of Central Asia. At a time long remote, a spiritual revelation was given to the wild tribes dwelling in the trans-Himalayan highlands. The prophet of that time is referred to in the old writings as the father of the Arya. In a great house he called together the old men, the priests, the chiefs of the tribes, and those who practiced dreams and enchantments. He revealed to them the will of the gods and established a covenant. In the end, the great Lord returned to the land of the immortals, leaving behind him the rites, rituals, and mysteries of his religion. The migrations of the Arya tribes, first southward, and later in a westerly direction, extended the esoteric traditions of these people into India, Persia, the Near East, Europe, and finally the Western Hemisphere. All the dominant religions flourishing today either belong to the Arya complex or are compounds of Arya and Atlantean esoteric traditions. Thus, Brahmanism, Buddhism, Islamism, and modern Judaism are as much the faith of our race as is Christianity. All are blossoms upon a single plant. The same mystical and philosophical keys unlock the secret tradition of each of these religions, and the knowledge of one assists in the understanding of the others. Syria, because of its geographical location, became an important center of spiritual culture. It was a meeting ground of East and West, for here merchants exchanged their wares and their opinions. Along the caravan routes from furthermost Asia passed the religions of the East to mingle in the marketplace with the faiths and philosophies of the Mediterranean countries. We should remember that a new statement of spiritual ideals must come as the result of the meeting and mingling of older doctrines. Religions are subject to a law of generation and must be born in an atmosphere of spiritual democracy. Homogeneous cultures are not procreative, for they are without the dynamic contrast which stimulates the mind to larger inclusive concepts. Growth is a process of inclusion, and conversely, decadence is a process of exclusion. Heterogeneous cultures, like heterogeneous nations, are dynamic, for they present a constant challenge. We find the same policy in the modern management of business. Experience has proved that even in the prosaic concerns of high finance, the theory of tycoons is unsound. As time goes on, we will have fewer one-man corporations. Today, great business organizations are governed by groups rather than by individuals. The skilled opinions of many united in a common cause ensure a better balanced program than the arbitrary though brilliant administration of one person. At the time we associate with the founding of our faith, the Holy Land was a kind of alchemical bottle or magic cauldron, where a strange brew was foaming and bubbling. In addition to the old Jewish tradition, a compound of Chaldean, Babylonian, Egyptian, and indigenous Syrian elements, there was a conglomeration of imported beliefs. Hindu Jesus and occultism, Buddhist ethical agnosticism, Chinese mysticism, Persian anthropomorphism, Greek naturalistic idealism, Roman materialism, late Egyptian metaphysics, scattered secret esoteric societies, and even primitive nature cults with their magical practices mingled in colorful confusion and found what roots they could in the barren soil of Palestine. From this complicated mingling of East and West was born a new faith to meet a coming world emergency. In its inception, Christianity was distinctly eclectic. That is, it contained a mass of unrelated and ill-digested material, but this eclecticism was the secret of its survival. The faith was forced to develop from within itself certain common denominators. And in its search for these denominators, it discovered two of dynamic importance: the twin concepts of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. It did not invent these convictions, but it emphasized them more successfully than most of the earlier faiths. The emphasis was due in part to geographical location and in part to psychological pressure. Most early religions were peculiar to nations or communities, and such conflict as arose was factional within one racial and even lingual complex. But Palestine was verging towards internationalism, not because it was a powerful country, but because its citizens were the victims of countless infusions of outside cultures. In addition to these factors, the political condition of Syria played an important part. The history of the Jews is a long and tragic chronicle of war, bondage, and captivity. Oppression always stimulates national consciousness and binds oppressed groups to the common cause of their own survival. Minorities always develop that type of belligerence which bears witness to an inferiority complex. When we are frustrated in our effort to dominate externals, we are inclined to retreat into ourselves and indulge in extravagant daydreaming as an escape mechanism. This very introversion brings with it powerful internal resolutions and an intensification of the reflective faculties. From the beginning of history, most of the world's work has been accomplished by neurotics. The extrovert scatters his resources, but the introvert develops penetration and one-pointedness of action. The early Christians exhibited a fine inferiority complex. Nearly all of the Christian writers prior to the Council of Nicaea were apologists for their faith. They were a minority group subject to constant persecution, not only for their religious convictions, but for their political views. Early in their history, a division took place within the structure of the sect. In fact, there are traces of this impending schism even in the gospel narratives. When Jesus said that his kingdom was not of this world, some of his earliest followers differed strenuously. Gradually, the break widened, resulting in two armed camps. Those who held that the Christian mysteries were entirely metaphysical and internal inspired such sects as the Syrian and Egyptian Gnosis and the cult of Manas. These were philosophical institutions fully aware of the esoteric tradition and the place of the Christian revelation in the unfoldment of the one-world religion. The second group was convinced that Christianity was destined to attain not only spiritual but material sovereignty. Their dream was a church triumphant through the machinery of a church militant. Naturally, a larger number of converts could understand physical revolution than could appreciate spiritual regeneration. Most of us still believe in policies of aggressive action. As the new sect plunged into politics, it achieved considerable temporal advantage at the expense of spiritual integrity. By convincing Constantine the Great that it could serve as a useful political ally, the new sect gained control of the Roman Empire. Having reached comparative security, it then turned upon itself and stamped out the mystical groups, which were its own heart and soul. In order to maintain its claim to uniqueness, the rising church attempted to destroy all evidence of its own pagan origin. It denied that it was the product of spiritual evolution and insisted that its believers accept the faith as a peculiar revelation immaculately conceived. In times when most persons were unlearned and felt no drive towards scholarship, it was easy to convince them that in all things the church knew best and the church knew most. But the modern world, through sad experience, is less gullible. The unfolding human mind has outgrown the arbitrary boundaries of unquestioning allegiance to anything, human or divine. This does not mean that the thoughtful modern is an unbeliever or wishes to cast off his spiritual conviction. He merely wants the truth, and he feels that he is strong enough to bear the consequences of factual thinking. In this case, the facts are far more beautiful, more significant, and more inspiring than the illusion. Instead of scholarly investigation destroying the sensitive substance of faith, it justifies faith by revealing the true place of Christianity in the evolution of those human institutions which have been set up to explore and explain the secrets of God and nature. Religiously speaking, we are far stronger if we know that our faith is eternal than if we merely accept, without question, the statements of others about its eternity. We are also enriched if we discover that it is deep enough and wise enough to include within itself all progress and all learning. This larger understanding is absolutely necessary to the accomplishment of the very end which Jesus himself required of his followers, the brotherhood of man. It is difficult to visualize the ultimate fraternity of the human family if one dominant sect is to force its convictions upon all the rest and exterminate those who refuse to be converted. When the Christian can see all faiths within his own faith and his own faith within all other faiths, true spiritual democracy is within his grasp. It is no longer necessary to decide which amongst us is the holiest, and we also come to a fuller understanding of the essential nature of God. There are no longer believers and unbelievers, Christians and heathens, the elect and the damned. The religions of the world emerge as human institutions glorifying a divine reality. This is not only a realization which enriched the consciousness of the individual, but a powerful social force toward world peace. Nearly all wars are holy, or more correctly, unholy wars. Religious prejudices are always stimulated to justify military aggression. Whenever we fight, we assume that God is on our side because we are the true believers. When someone asked Lincoln if God was on his side at the time of the Civil War, the president replied in substance that he was not so much concerned as to whether God was on his side, but as to whether he was on God's side. In the religion of the future, we must come to know that God is always on the side of right, truth, beauty, wisdom, progress, and brotherhood. Someday we may even learn that God is on the side of peace, but we cannot have peace while we cause war. And we shall continue to cause war until our own internal understanding of the universal plan is deeper and more compelling than hate, pride, and selfishness. Christendom has a magnificent opportunity to bind up the wounds of mankind, for it is the dominant faith of its day. But to be dominant is not enough. It cannot survive because it is stronger numerically or politically. It can only survive if it proves through action that it is dedicated to the works of God and nature. It is important that we examine into the origin of our faith, and it is equally important that we restore the streams of esoteric tradition which, flowing together, produced this new focal point in the descent of an ageless truth. We are not better because we are different, and we are not stronger because we stand alone. We are better and stronger when we have a larger consciousness. All spiritual motion is toward unity, toward the discovery and experience of oneness. That which divides is false to itself and the world, and false to the teachings of Christ. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a Syrian mystic, probably an initiate of secret societies dedicated even then to the essential values of humanity, preached a doctrine of brotherhood by the shores of Galilee. It is possible that he dreamed of a human destiny much like the little community of ascetics we know as the Essene. These simple folk lived together in a condition of gentle friendliness. They reserved nothing for themselves, but labored for the common good. They were not deceived by worldly wealth, honor, or position. They believed that each man should earn his bread with the sweat of his brow, and that he should share it with the children, the aged, the widow, and the fatherless. Again, Jesus may have known the Therapeutai who gave their lives to learning, convinced that men live in this world not merely to accumulate physical possessions, but to study, improve themselves, and worship their God with song and dance and simple joys. Through the teachings of Jesus, an old world wise with living gave a legacy of spiritual security to a new world strong, ambitious, and intolerant. It is sad indeed that we have been content to deify the man, calling his name sacred and his words inspired, and at the same time have failed utterly to live his doctrine that we should love one another. In the future, other faiths will come to men, other prophets will lead them, other sages will instruct them, and other mystics will inspire them. Our religion will be part of the past like the religions of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, but the religion will not perish. The faiths of the past live in the faiths of today, and our religion will live in the faiths of tomorrow. It would be well for us to fix this realization in our hearts and minds so that we can seek everywhere for the inspiration and ideals we need in daily living. It is also good to remember that small groups that appear to have limited spheres of influence and then pass away are not lost. It is quite possible that the little Essene community of 4,000 common people is responsible for some of the highest concepts and convictions of modern men and women. There is grandeur about this realization that into the one sublime motion of our spiritual convictions has been absorbed but never lost the teachings of all those inspired messengers who have come to the world in past ages. Not one of them lived or died in vain. Their doctrines are imperishable, and the light that lighted the first man will cast its radiance upon the last man. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.